When your mind, you're not preoccupied by something else, you simply take a moment and think about something in your life that's meaningful to you, but that you're probably taking utterly for granted. And then you give yourself a flickering instant to imagine that that thing ceases to be part of your life. And you might even try to fill it in with an image, right? And then stop doing that. Get back to life. Because if you dwelled on bad things, that's bad news. You're not going to be a happy camper. But to give yourself a moment's thought about losing something that is part of your life. These are all things that if you're a normal human being, you take utterly for granted. And you go about your day on the assumption they're always going to be there for you. Except, guess what? They aren't. And the way I can say that with such finality is someday you're going to be gone.
Welcome to Be Human, Bill.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, Bill, I'm so excited for this conversation. Obviously, we've been speaking before we press record. I've already had many wise words shared from you. So I'm excited to delve even deeper into your headspace and your mindset and your philosophy. Where I want to start is I've read your book twice now, or one of your books, A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. So where I wanted to start is kind of just the really baseline foundation of what is the Stoic philosophy. And particularly, can you kind of share why is something like Stoicism so misinterpreted when it comes to just understanding the philosophy and what it is about?
Okay. Stoicism came into existence in 300 BC in Greece. And back then, people would start schools of philosophy. You could start your own. And I like to compare it to schools of martial arts, where you come up with a new way of fighting that's a blend of the other ways of fighting. And then, hey, you can make a living doing that. That's basically what it
Welcome
was.
to
So you
Be
didn't go to
Human, Bill.
university to get exposed to it. And the people who taught it.
So, Bill, I'm so excited for this conversation.
And they had to give the students
speaking
something
before we press record.
of value,
I've already
because
had many
otherwise
wise
there's
words
absolutely
shared
no
from you.
reason
So I'm
to
excited
go.
to
So the
delve
typical
even
school
deeper
of philosophy
into your
would
headspace and your mindset and your philosophy.
teach students things they
Where I
needed
wanna
in
start
life, one of
is
which
I've
was
read your book
reasoning
twice now,
skill,
or
one
one
of
of your
which
books,
was
A
speaking
Guide to
skill,
the Good
because a lot
Life,
of them were going to
The
go on to
Ancient
be
Art of Stoic Joy.
politicians or engaged in the law in some sense. But they also said one of the most important things you can take away is an idea of what a good life is and some insight into how to have a good life. So there's that component. So the Greeks, we have almost none of their writings, but fortunately, the Romans adopted their views. And we have the four great Roman Stoics, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, and the fourth, less known, is Musonius Rufus, who's actually in some ways one of the more interesting of those. And they took it and ran with it. They sort of came up with some really wonderful stuff. One of the interesting things is they added a whole layer of psychology to what the Greeks had done. So it became they were also the preeminent logicians of their time. But they came up with these psychological insights that have only been rediscovered in the second half of the 20th century. These tricks our minds play on us routinely. And they said, that's one of the reasons why people who are miserable in life are miserable, is that these psychological phenomena are tripping them up. And so they also, so that's one thing to say, here's the problem. They also offered strategies to avoid those things from happening. Now, in my own life, it's a kind of curious history, because I was a philosophy major in college. I encountered the Stoics in a logic class, because they did propositional logic, logic of if then and or, the kind that's used in computers. But I had no idea. Nobody ever said in the classes that they also had this thing called a philosophy of life. And so it was only as like a 50-something-year-old person that I was writing a different book, and I came across them again. And I said, oh, guess what? They did something other than logic. And I started looking at the psychological side and just was blown away and started thinking, this is great stuff. Why was I not taught this? Why does the world not know about this? So if I ask you what a Stoic is, and you go look it up in the dictionary, the dictionary will say, well, it's somebody who just stands there grimly and it's puckering his lips and he's trying hard to hold in his anger. That's what a Stoic is. But the Stoics, so I call that a lowercase s Stoic. Uppercase s Stoics, the actual philosophers, were completely different than that. They didn't say you should suppress your emotions. They said, number one, you should divide your emotions into the negative ones and the positive ones. The negative ones are ones like anger and envy and regret. Positive ones are like delight, joy, a sense of awe. They said, first of all, you take the negative ones. You shouldn't suppress them. You shouldn't even be having them. And they said, and we know how you can take great strides towards not even having them. The positive emotions, boy, you should enjoy those. And they also had strategies for increasing your chance of enjoying. They're so precious, these little moments of delight in life. When something happens, or you see something, or you encounter something, and to be simply swept away by it. As a kid, you could do that. As a kid, that was natural. What happened? You outgrew it. You became a teenager and you said, well, there's nothing that impresses me. Well, that's one way to live, and that's the normal way. But unfortunately, you're cutting yourself off from a lot of the good things life has to offer.
And when you say good life, is this something that is up to sort of our own individual interpretation and preference? Or is there a definition that kind of comes with being a Stoic?
For the Stoics, and this is actually true of Zen Buddhists, and it's actually true of Epicureans, and it's actually true of skeptics, and it's actually true of cynics as well. What's a good life? It's one that of equanimity. It's one, you could also use the word tranquility, but it's a dangerous word to use because it can mean other things. But it's one where your life is as free as possible of negative emotions and as full as possible of positive emotions. And it's a really interesting spin to put on things, because if you take somebody who's got a bunch of money, just a bunch of money, and has got multiple houses, maybe they're palaces, who knows? You know what? If he has a troubled mind, I don't want to be him. I don't want to be him because he's got a troubled mind, because he's going to be up in the middle of the night angry at something. He's going to be having trouble making friends because the anger is coming through. So he can keep the money. What do I want? I want the peace of mind. So there are other ways you can do it. You can pack just different ways. You could say, well, I want a life with as much physical pleasure as I can get. Okay, that's a strategy. And I guess that's a coherent strategy, but it's risky. It's risky in a number of different respects. So that's what the Stoics came up with, and they thought that this is something a sensible person would pursue. By the way, Zen Buddhists are pursuing the same thing. They just have a radically different strategy to pursue it. So they say, well, you've got to meditate. You've got to wait for a moment of enlightenment. Now here I'm getting in over my head because I haven't done deep study of it, but in one form, you wait for your moment of enlightenment. Stoicism, well, you can get it. No, you don't have to meditate. You don't have to wait 30 years for your moment of enlightenment. It'll take you a few days. You can get the basics down. You can test drive the strategies, and you very quickly, you'll know, are they making a difference in your life or are they not? And in which case you can commit to it if you want. You can do it on the sly. Nobody needs to know, you don't have to shave your head or anything like that. Nobody needs to know. So what is it? They might guess, though. They might say, he seemed so gloomy before, and now he just seems to be a happy camper, having fun, enjoying life, and things that used to bother him just duck off, water off a duck's back. So
I want to talk to you about some of these psychological techniques. This is really the favorite part of your book for me because they are so practical. And as you're suggesting, it's not like there is a length of time that sort of needs to be waited to get to these certain things. These are things that we can incorporate right now if we so choose and have beautiful effects in terms of sort of moving into that aspect of tranquility in life. One of the first ones you talk about is negative visualization. And again, sort of in line with this misinterpretation, I've heard of this technique also being highly misinterpreted as to what the goal is. Can you speak more to what is this technique and how do we experience optimism from this and not what a lot of people sort of interpret as a pathway to pessimism?
yeah, it's got a terrible name, negative visualization.
Yeah,
That just sounds so negative. But what you do is in the course of a day, when your mind, you're not preoccupied by something else, you simply take a moment and think about something in your life that's meaningful to you, but that you're probably taking utterly for granted. And then you give yourself a flickering instant to imagine that that thing ceases to be part of your life. And you might even try to fill it in with an image, right? And then stop doing that. Get back to life. Because if you dwelled on bad things, that's bad news. You're not going to be a happy camper. But to give yourself a moment's thought about losing something that is part of your life. What can it be? It can be your health. It can be your spouse or your partner. It can be your job. It can be your income. These are all things that if you're a normal human being, you take utterly for granted. And you go about your day on the assumption they're always going to be there for you. Except, guess what? They aren't. And the way I can say that with such finality is someday you're going to be gone.
right.
So when that happens, you go. One of the things Stoics said is you should also think about your own death, and we can get into that deeper. But this is sounding so negative. But the interesting thing is, if you try that experiment, and again, it takes a few seconds. If you try that experiment, you will find that afterwards, you have this kind of afterglow where you find yourself truly appreciating the thing that you had been taking for granted. And it's unfortunate because we humans are programmed. We work so hard to get something. And then once we get it, what do? It's really great for a minute, for an hour, for a day.
Right.
Then it's just background. And I now keep track when I get good news. I keep track of how long afterwards. And it's just amazing how quickly it goes. And then I'm right back where I was before, thinking, oh, there's something. If only I got it, I would live happily ever after. They call that the hedonic treadmill. That's a psychological term for it. But we're on this treadmill. We always see it. We're like the guy in the desert seeing what looks like water. And we cross 3 miles of desert in the hot sun, and we get there and it's only a mirage. But wait, look, 3 miles further. And of course, it's another mirage. And you can spend your entire life doing that. Or you can take a look at the life you're living and realize how absolutely blessed you are. And even if you tell me, well, hey, I'm not blessed. I lost my job. You give me the list. Guess what? Give me about 12 seconds and I'll tell you 4 different ways things could be worse. Anybody who's alive now, well, of course, that's a sweeping generalization because there are some people in some parts of the planet that are living very, very miserable lives. Slavery is still
Yeah.
in existence in our planet. But other than that, you are living the dream world of your great, great, great grandparents. You have probably in your pocket, you have a cell phone that to them would have been an utterly miraculous device. It allows you to, my standard line is, if you wanted to right now, you could order pizza in Hong Kong. You could, and you could see the face of the guy, at the other end when you're doing it. And yet you look at people, do they understand how unprecedented that ability is in human history? And then you'll find that what they're instead thinking about is, they're going to release the upgraded model of my phone in 2 months, and I got to save money to get that. So we have it so good compared to people on other parts of the planet, compared to our ancestors, and yet we take it for granted.
Yeah, the beautiful lesson that really hit me yesterday in rereading your book was that the idea behind this technique is that when we spend time imagining losing the things we value, we create desire for the things we already have. That was really big for me. And certainly something I kind of sat with for a moment. And I was like, in relation to sort of the hedonic adaptation that you talk about, it's just incredible what you're speaking to, of how quickly we adapt to our new level of normal. And then it's always that sort of insatiability of wanting more and more and more. I feel like that's such a true representation, particularly now with all the access that we have. This desire is just absolutely overwhelming and taking control of us. I'd love to explore, Bill. You shared in your book a quote about lessening the impact when bad things happen. And this isn't your quote. I'm sorry, there was a footnote, but I didn't see who this was to. But it says, he robs present ills of their power who has perceived their coming beforehand. And it made me think of a quote that I heard recently by Mark Twain that says, I have lived a long life and had many troubles, most of which never happened. And I feel like it's kind of on the other side of what we're talking about here. But it kind of made me think, with this negative visualization, it seems there is this intention behind it that's missing with us just purely kind of letting our mind control and drive us in this sense of fear. Is that kind of the difference between being able to sit in the intentionality of being able to negative visualize something that we don't necessarily want in our lives versus being uncontrollably driven by that fear?
Yeah. So anxiety was another thing. I mean, that's a negative emotion. There are people who have extreme anxiety. Stoicism won't work for them. They probably need some form of medication or therapy. By the way, cognitive behavioral therapy, called CBT, is based on Stoicism. So when I sometimes I'll have people write to me and they'll describe the anxieties they have, and I'll say, unfortunately, Stoicism is a reason-based therapy and or philosophy. And if it really is just, you have voices in your head, and it can't help you with that. But anxiety is a negative emotion. And so the Stoics had a separate line for dealing with that. And it's called the dichotomy of control, which in the book I break into 3 parts. And they said, you know what, when you find yourself worrying about something, what you do is you dismantle it into the parts you can control and the parts you can't control. And then just focus yourself on the parts you can control. Do your best. Do your best with the parts you can control. And the parts you can't control, if you're worrying about those, you're a fool. How come? Because you can't control them. So one way to do it is suppose you're preparing to play a tennis match. You're in some kind of competition and you're preparing. So what can you control? You can control how hard you practice. You can control the other training you do besides your tennis practice. You can control the strategy you take into the game with you. You can control whether you ate right before the game. There's all these things. Hey, focus your attention on that. Now, if you did all that and the other person still beats you, well, it just wasn't in the cards,
Yeah.
You did what you could. And if that wasn't good enough, it just wasn't there. And so you can be very forgiving. Your failures. Well, I row competitively. I'm a sculler, not a sweep rower. If your audience knows the difference there. So I've got 2 oars instead of 1. And the interesting thing is, for me, winning and losing is part of the game, but the biggest single thing is it's a kind of a contest against myself. So we do, as masters, we do these 1,000-meter races that take a bit more than 4 minutes. And I call it the 4-minute flu, because you're at the starting line and you feel just fine. You're wonderful. Maybe nervous and focused, but physically you feel fine. And by the end, it's like you have a bad case of the flu, or these days, COVID, where you're just gasping, you're semi-coherent. You're everything else. And when I describe that to some people who don't compete, they say, why would you do that to yourself? And the answer is, because I get a front row seat to watch the voices in my head that try to seduce me. Bill, you could slow down. You could quit. You could quit rowing right now. And so for me to do battle with those forces to the end, right? That is triumph. Now, if I end up, sometimes happens, not really often, but if I end up at the front, great. But that isn't the real race. The real race is the race against myself. And the rest is this external thing. Another thing in rowing, so I've done some coaching in rowing, and I tell the rowers what my mentor told me, and he said, you keep your head in the boat. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you don't look at what the other boats are doing because you can't affect what they're doing. You can affect what your boat is doing. And in rowing, in running, if you glance to the side, that's probably no big deal. In rowing, if you do, you could catch a crab, technical term there. You could you could have a major kind of disaster because it's a very technical sport. So what do? You know what? You row your boat the best you can, the fastest you can over 1,000 meters. And if that's not good enough, you can walk away proud. How come? You did the best you could do.
Yeah.
What you're hoping is that they're all going to be thinking about you instead of their own race, because then they're likely to make a mistake.
And you speak about these voices that come up in your head during competition, and we can all relate to this. And this is obviously not just in competition that we meet these voices, that many of us kind of live with quite loud voices in our head throughout the day that aren't always being our biggest fan. What is how do Stoics approach these voices in our head that are sort of in conflict with the person that we want to be?
Well, we have layers within us. So the interesting thing is, they had this insight that we've got this rational part of the brain, but that's only one component of the brain, because within our skull, it's like we have 3 different personalities living together. And lately, I've changed, working on this project, changed the analogy a little bit. So, we can speak in terms of how the brain developed. Your ancestors go far enough back in your family tree, and your ancestors were reptiles. I don't mean that in a figurative sense. I mean, they were literally reptiles. And so they had this reactive reptilian brain, they could do reflexive things, had basic drives, sex drive, fear, pain. And then go forward in your family tree and you'll find mammals who had the emotions. And then finally, and this would have been in the last 100, 200,000 years, you had this rational component. But the interesting thing is the brain didn't replace the earlier components. It kept them there and just put new components on top of them. So you've got within you those 3 components. And that's part of the human predicament, is you on a daily basis have to battle with those. So a lot of the voices you get are the reptilian part of the brain, sort of saying, you should be angry. He just said something. You should be angry. okay, I'm going to make your blood pressure rise. Come on, get angry. The emotional part is going to be saying, he hurt my feelings. And I'm going to cry. I'm going to break down and cry. And then the rational component has to deal with them. So I've slightly altered lately. I've been thinking about this, the metaphor a little bit. Imagine that you're on a road trip and you're the driver of the car, the rational component. And in the back seat, you have two teenagers, one of whom has anger issues and one of whom has emotional issues, right? And suppose the one who's angry is always trying to start a fight with the other one, or start a fight with you, and the emotional one is always just crying and breaking down. And you're trying to drive the car. You just want to get where you're going.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. They could drive you nuts doing what they're doing. And you always have the option of pulling over at a truck stop somewhere and saying, you two, out. You figure out some other way. Now, I'm not sure this is legal. Depends on how old they are, I suppose. So don't do this at home. Okay. Don't do this at home. But you'd have that option.
Yeah.
Well, in your life, you don't have the option of kicking out these two obnoxious passengers. They're going to be with you till the day you die. And that means you need to come up with a strategy for coping with them. So it's this coping strategy. And so they're the source of many of your negative emotions. And so the Stoics said, you know, what we need to do is find a way, use our rational part of our brain to come up with a strategy for not only not letting them disrupt our life, but for kind of harnessing that primal kind of energy that they have and using it for good ends. So brilliant insights on their part.
So what would they say in terms of sort of this strategy of being able to, as you said, they're going to be in the car for the rest of our lives? How would you speak to being able to be in that, connected with that rational state of mind when we are feeling sort of angry and emotional? Because I think when we're really in those moments, like how many moments do we have where we buy into the emotional part, the angry part? And once that's sort of been said and done, our rational part sort of comes to us and goes, "Whoa, gosh, what was that? What were we thinking? Why did we do that?" What do you think is a good strategy sort of in that interim period of being able to like kind of pause and like sort of reconnect with that rational part?
Okay. Guide to the Good Life, which is the book you've read, has a sequel called Stoic Challenge, in which I kind of go into just that thing. So when something happens to you that has the potential to disrupt your day, I call it the 5-second rule. You have 5 seconds there, and what you do is you repackage the thing that happened. So you've got this ability to frame how things happen. So somebody insults you. There's one side of you that's going to want to take offense, that's going to want to get angry, that's going to want to get hurt feelings. And in the natural course of things, that's what will happen because you're wired that way. It isn't wires, it's neurons, but you're wired that way. So a lot of times, if you act quickly, you can divert that process. So for instance, somebody insults you. One of the things you can do is not get angry or not fight back, but you can say, if you think that's an insult, then you don't know me well enough to be insulting me because I'm much worse than what you just said. You can turn it into a kind of joke, right? At their expense, at their expense. So in Stoic Challenge, I also describe it's kind of like a game where when you have something bad happen to you, you frame it as a test. All right, what kind of test, and who's giving the test, and who's creating the test? And I have these imaginary beings. I call them the Stoic gods. They're testing you. Well, why do they do that? Are they mad at me? No, they're good coaches. They want you to have a good life, and so they're going to toughen you up. And so these little things that happen, some are little tiny things, like you trip on a shoelace. Some of them are huge things, like you're diagnosed with a a terrible disease, but these are life's challenges. And so one of the things you can do is you can say, oh, I'm being tested. Now, the tests are self-graded. So how do you pass the test? Well, number one, you find a way to work around whatever obstacle has come up. And number two, you stay calm and cool while doing it. And it's a weird sort of thing, I know, but it's remarkably effective because you've immediately sidetracked the whole process where you should be getting frustrated and angry. Instead, you prick up and say, oh, this is a good test. Watch me. Now, I said the Stoic odds are imaginary. I don't think they actually exist. I nevertheless do talk to them from time to time. They've never talked back. I've been told that if they ever do start talking back, that's a bad sign. And if they do exist, I'm convinced that they hang out at airports because that's where so many setbacks take place. And they're also tech savvy because have you ever had your computer freeze up at the exact moment you had to send something off?
Absolutely.
Well, that was a test. And then the question was, did you get around that?
I want to talk to you about relationship with time. And where I'd love to start is particularly in relation to our relationship to our past and present, and sort of with the practicality of letting go.
Yeah, past and present. Interesting thing is we don't live in the moment. It's very difficult to do. And a lot of people say that's what we should be doing. Well, good luck with that, because our ancestors on the savannas of Africa, 100,000 years ago, the ones who had the ability to live for the moment, they got eaten. Or they didn't get something that they could eat, so they dropped out of the equation. The ones that survived were the ones that thought about the past, about things that had happened, and if they were bad, how can I avoid that happening again? If they're good, how can I make that happen again? And thinking about the future. I'm going to be hungry in a few hours, so I better start looking. So we're wired not to savor the moment, but to look backwards and to look forwards. And looking backwards, there's a danger, because I know when I look backwards, the things that jump out at me are the tiny little slights that I've experienced. And I've seen that in other people as well. I know people who are suffering from dementia, and they can't tell you what day of the week it is. Although now that I'm retired, I'm not sure what day of the week it is. But they can't tell you what day of the week, what month it is, what season it is, but they can tell you in detail about somebody who insulted them 40 years before. And that says something about the human condition. As far as the future goes, realize there will come a time in your life, should you live long enough, where you will look back to this very instant and you will wish that you could be here now. Not because you're talking to me, not anything like that, but you'll look back and you'll realize, I was so young then, and I could do so many things, and I had my podcast going, and I was doing competitive running. You can go through that whole list, and those are things you can't even imagine doing later on. So believe it or not, these are the good old days. Now, if you tell me, yeah, but I just lost my job. Yeah, well, guess what? There could come a time, if you live long enough, where you'll say, remember when I was strong enough to get up and go out and do things.
And how does this play into, in your book, you sort of describe this idea of having a grand goal of, what do we want out of life? How does our relationship with the future and sort of living in the present play into understanding what our grand goal of life is?
Stoics said your grand goal in life should be to have a life of equanimity, and that is a life with as few negative emotions and as many positive emotions as you can. If you've got that, that's been a good life. And there may be other things that would be the icing on the cake. Can't offhand imagine what they would be, but that's a good life, and you can go into other things. Most people say, did you find somebody who loved you? I think it's almost more important, did you find someone who could be loved and who could accept that love? I think you get more from loving than from being loved, but that's arguable. We can talk about that. So But that's what they held up as the grand goal. And oh, by the way, so do Buddhists. Now, have to be careful here because Buddhism isn't a monolithic thing. There are several different varieties of Buddhism, but certainly the Zen Buddhists, that's what they were looking for. And then the Epicureans, we think of them as the party people, but no, that isn't what they were looking for either. So you have all these different approaches that agreed on this same thing. Should I want money? Well, money's interesting, money's useful. But you know what? If you have to live a mind full of turmoil to get that money, man, that was a bad bargain on your part. There are poor people who are much happier than some some billionaires, you know?
Absolutely.
It's a puzzle of life.
So it's about, you can have goals within this grand goal, but experiencing equanimity is the primary goal. So it's kind of like everything needs to be in synonymous with that.
Well, see, here's the way of putting it. How do people get through their days? They make up goals from minute to minute. Do they have a grand plan? No, just, hey, what do I need now? And the goals they make up from minute to minute can be just this bizarre assortment of goals, because what happens is something triggers desire in them. So for instance, somebody wakes up in the morning and starts, let's see, do people read the newspaper anymore? But he's online and he starts noticing car ads, and he starts seeing an ad for a particular kind of car. And then before you know it, he's going into deep kind of research of how much would it cost? Could I do the payments and so on? And that's just a random thing. And then you could say, well, do you need a new car? And he said, well, my old one's 3 years old. Okay, do you need a new car? In fact, do you need a car at all? I mean, how much do you use it? And you can go through the whole process. And you realize it was just this random desire that popped into his head. But because it was in his head, he took ownership of it. He said, it must be what I want, because it was there in my head. And the unfortunate thing is that means you don't have this strategy. You just live day by day and you don't build towards something. And that means that what you want tomorrow can undo what you wanted today. So today, what do you want? Oh, I better start a retirement account. Tomorrow, oh, they have this great new car. I want that car. Great. I got the money in the retirement account. So your day is always kind of working against yourself, your life. And the Stoics said, no, you need one grand goal, because once you get that, it kind of organizes the goals, puts the goals, the sub goals into context with each other. So you can say, do I want this new car? Yeah, I sure do. Okay, but let's think it through. If I get it, what will that mean? Well, of course, I'll have to make payments. Well, then will you have a retirement account? Well, I guess I'll have less than that. So what will that do to the future you? You know, a lot of things we call sacrifices. Sometimes you do sacrifice for other people or for your country, but a lot of sacrifices you make are sacrifices for the future you. They're sacrifices that allow you to give a gift to yourself. So right now, you are benefiting from sacrifices you made for you in the past. You know how to read. Hey, a younger you took the time, wanted to do other things, took the time to learn that. And you've got that gift. So you can give yourself gifts in the future. But it's going to take a little bit of self-discipline on your part. It's going to take planning. And for the Stoics, what's the idea? Fill your life, long-term remaining days to the extent possible with positive emotions, and try to avoid. You're not stifling, you're trying to avoid altogether negative emotions.
I want to talk to you about shame. In your book, you describe that the Stoics sort of almost have this training exercise to teach themselves to be ashamed only of what was really shameful. Can you elaborate on what that exercise looks like?
So it's easy to be shamed about a bunch of things, and other people can try to shame us, and sometimes they succeed. The interesting thing is that the Stoics tended to be independent-minded people, and they didn't care about social status. But I have to be careful. We are all wired to care very much about social status. And that's why even slights, small insights, we've got this insult detector built into us. And once it acknowledges that somebody's looking down on us, then we take it very personally. So the Stoics, the idea was they would realize, number one, they're playing a different game than everybody else is playing. So what's everybody else doing? They're doing the game where they want to be rich and famous. And rich, it means different things. It can simply mean that you've got more money than your neighbor does. Famous means what? Now we've got internet fame. We've got all these different forms of fame, but you want people admiring you, or better still, envying you. Envy is a really interesting emotion and really dangerous emotion. So we want that's what people think they want. And a Stoic is going to say, but Stoics will play a different game. He knows those things are worthless in some sense, worthless. So he's got a different game. What's his game? It's the equanimity game. He wants to have positive emotions and avoid negative emotions. And so if somebody who has $1 billion looks down on him and says, well, you're poor, I got a lot more. Oh, and look at this house. Oh, and look at this car, right? The Stoic will say, okay, you win, but you win the game you're playing. Right. I'm playing an entirely different game. So it's okay because I win and you win, right? We're both okay. So Stoic cares very much about what some people think about him. Who? Well, like I care if I could resurrect Seneca, the Stoic, I would care very much. I would ask, how am I doing, Seneca? Come on. Am I up to it? But there are other people that if they approved of what I was doing, I would be very nervous because I can see that they're playing such a different game than I'm playing, that their approval would mean that I was playing their game instead of my game. So, I would think, what am I doing wrong? They approve. So that whole notion of shame,
interesting.
If it's other people shaming us, or if it's us feeling ashamed because we aren't up to their standards, then the next step is, well, let's think about their standards. Do they have the right standards?
That's incredibly powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Bill. As we wrap up here, I want to talk to you about death. It's something actually at the beginning of this conversation that you briefly brought up and said that we could speak to, and I would love to speak to you about it. Particularly, I'm sort of realizing in developing a better relationship with death, we can certainly leverage it for living a good life. Can you share how you utilize your relationship with death?
So there's another Stoic exercise. It's called the last time meditation. And what you do is whenever you're doing something, you pause. And again, you don't dwell on these things because that'd be a miserable life, but you pause to consider the possibility that this is the last time in your life that you will do the thing in question. For instance, right now I can list some last times that you've done. When's the last time you used a dial telephone? Let's see, I'm trying to figure out if you're old enough to have used a dial telephone.
And it was a long time ago.
When's the last time you played hopscotch? You can go through the list and you'll realize there's just this long series of last times. And everything you do, because you're mortal, everything you do in life, there will be a last time you do it. So on a hot summer day, I'll be out mowing the lawn. It's summer where I am, I guess not where you are, but I'll be out mowing the lawn. And, it's a sweaty job and tiring, noisy and everything else. But I'll remind myself, there will be a last time I mow it. And there's possibly this could be it. But it takes some of the sting out of it, just realizing that this could be it. So ran out of cloves for the kitchen. These are ground cloves. Don't use a lot of ground cloves, but ran out and went out to buy a little jar of ground cloves. And as I was buying them, the thought popped into my mind that this could be, for me, a life's supply of ground clothes.
Wow.
And,
Yeah.
you tell some people that, and they say, that's terribly negative. Are you deeply depressed? And the reply is no. No, I'm very much in love with the life I'm living. And so I'm not going to go through my days assuming that it's infinite, that I get to do these things forever, because I can't. Moving on to a different project I'm working on here, I have the feeling that a lot of people, if they went to heaven, they would be absolutely miserable. Two reasons. Number one is they would take their personality with them.
Mm.
And if they couldn't take their personality, would it really be them who went to heaven? But if they took their personality with them, they're going to be just as hard to please as they were on earth. Well, somebody else got to sit on the right hand of God and I didn't, and it's my
Right.
turn, and I'm going to be upset by that. The other thing is, in heaven, you have infinitely many days. So if you waste today, is that an issue? No, because you got infinitely many. On earth, it's an issue. You have X number of days left. Don't know the value of X, but you do know it is a number. And so each day you sort of say, you know what, I'll just wait till tomorrow, or better still, till next week, or I'll put it off indefinitely. You can spend your day in that kind of idling mode, where you're just watching cute kitty videos on YouTube, when you could be doing something else. Okay, I'm not talking down cute videos, right? On
There's
kitty
a time and
videos,
place.
but they have their place. Nobody, when they get up in the morning, puts on their to-do list,
Right.
this afternoon, watch cute kitty videos. No one does that. But there are a bunch of people who at the end of the afternoon realize that they didn't do the things on their to-do list because they were watching cute kitty videos.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly a powerful one that I've been incorporating more into my life. And I mean, even with this podcast, that was sort of it was quite a stoic decision to make, was kind of panning out later years, if there was such a thing, but being able to sort of look back and think whether I'd done this or not and how I would feel. And it sort of brought me very much into the present and into the present day, and being really appreciative that I've taken those steps and had the courage to lean into this and be able to be with beautiful people like yourself, Bill. And I want to thank you so much, Bill, for this beautiful conversation. You're such a calming presence. Your ability to simplify complex topics is really admirable, and I really appreciate everything that you've shared today.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I've had fun. That's what counts. I had
That's
fun.
what counts. I'd love to ask you on a final note, Bill, what does it mean to you to be human?
To be human this ties into some stuff we said before. To be human is to be locked into this skull with these other two components, the kind of angry and the emotional component, because to me, the peak of the human experience is when you detect in yourself conflicting emotions, when you realize simultaneously that something is so beautiful and yet that it's so sad. When you can experience those two things at the same moment, that's proof that you're truly human. And they're some of the finest moments life has to offer. Where you're watching something. Now I'm a guy, so I never cry. All right, we got that straight?
I believe you.
So watching something and then notice that there's a tear trickling, right? And that's just such an incredible moment. And if I didn't have the complex inner stuff going on, that emotion would be impossible. So I'm delighted to be able to have that. That's what the human experience is.